We're back for our continuing discussion of the High Middle Ages around the world. We're going to be dealing with Europe in this part. We're going to be talking about the centralization, forming of nation states in Western Europe, and the decentralization that takes place in Central Europe. But most of the rest of the topics are going to have to do with people dying. There's going to be a lot of killing, there's going to be a lot of death. We're going to have a series of crusades that take place in Western Asia. We're going to have the Black Death, which takes place across 3 continents that kills a lot of people, and then peasant revolts and another series of wars that begin to take place. So there's really going to be a lot of dead people. When we talk about this political background, we're going to sort of compare and contrast a couple of different places. When we deal with this consolidation of a nation state, the fractured island that is England, where you've got different sort of vying groups. You've got Anglo-Saxons, you've got some Danes, you've got some Vikings, you've got a bunch of these different groups. You're going to have then another outsider that's going to come in, actually a French duke, a guy named William the Conqueror. He's a descendant of one of these Normans, these Vikings that have been living in what was northwestern France along the Norman Peninsula. And he had a claim to the English throne, but he was rebuffed by these Saxonic nobles, these guys that were of a different ethnic group, despite the fact that you've got a lot of intermarriage that had taken place, and said, no, we don't want this French guy coming in. And so to press his claim for power, he's going to lead this attack on England in 1066, and he's going to fight this big battle that takes place at Hastings, and long story short, he wins. His cavalry is going to overwhelm the French, or the British infantry, and he's going to conquer the island. He's actually the last person to do this. 1066 is the last time that Britain is conquered by somebody from the outside, right? That's actually not the interesting part of what we're going to be talking about, and that is, how do you, as a French Norman nobleman, king, consolidate power where you're surrounded by, for the most part, English, Saxon, other people? So, in order to consolidate his rule, one of the things that he wants to do is to circumvent the upper nobility, and he forces the local vassals to swear loyalty to him directly as king, as the royal sovereign, and not only to the immediate lords, which had been the previous practice. This is going to help strengthen the power of the monarchy in England. So there's William the Conqueror. Right? I love this one because he's so awesome that he can't just have one beard, he's got to have 2. This is the scenes from the Battle of Hastings, where his cavalry is overwhelming Harold's infantry in 1066. And this is going to help set up the Plantagenet dynasty that is going to continue for a while. And this is going to their family rule is going to continue to expand the role of the monarchy in the 12th and the 13th centuries. Right? These kings are going to set up a number of institutions and practices that's going to make sure that they are going to be absorbing more and more authority in themselves, rather than just breaking things up into local little autonomies. Right? To this end, they're going to set up a national independent treasury, right, to help control the nation's finances. Money is power. The ability to concentrate that money in one place is going to give power to the king. He's going to expand the role of the royal courts by taking on these cases from the local courts. The judiciary and the king's judges are going to be a good way to exercise his power at the local level. Now, Henry II is going to be less successful at controlling the church, which held a great deal of political power. Many people would say too much political power to be fully controlled. And of course, this comes along the idea that the church still had certain prerogatives for prosecuting some of its people, that, no, this guy may have committed a crime in your country, but he's part of the church, and so we have to prosecute him. Henry II tries to put one of his people in charge of the church, who then guy sides with the church. Guy winds up getting himself killed, partly at Henry's request. So it's a very complicated affair, and Henry had largely been winning the war against the church until Thomas's murder. And then it looks like, this guy's out to just kill church people, and so it's a very complicated political affair. So it doesn't completely go in Henry's favor. And you look at this picture here, you got the commoners, and the king is, you're going to be part of my kingdom. This is an important sort of political statement, that it isn't just the upper nobility that the king would consort with, but also he's going to be concerned with everybody. This is also a nice way to do an end run around any nobility that may not want to follow your rule. This is the office of the exchequer, right? The checkerboard where they keep track of the money from coming into and out of the government in various places. We're going to have some expansion here of the powers of the king, right? And the nobility are really, really feeling this loss of power. That as the king sort of grows in power, then the nobility is going to be losing power. Now, one of these unpopular kings is going to be John. This is Henry II's other son, right? We'll talk about Richard in a little bit later. And he is going to be becoming king after Richard abdicates, right? And John we remember John from the Robin Hood mythology that takes place. John really wasn't, a horrible human being, but he wasn't much of a king, and he had a lot of back and forth with the nobles over money and over power and over the armies and things like that. And the nobles are going to seize this moment when they gain a military advantage over John to force him to sign this Magna Carta, or the Great Charter. Now, you'd be over your head if you say, well, this is a constitution, and this provides for civil liberties and all this kind of stuff. It creates a parliament. It doesn't do any of that kind of stuff. But it does recognize, establishes formally what feudal rights for nobles and kings have. Basically, it creates, at least in some limited way, a limited monarchy, right? Which is an important step forward for what eventually will be liberal governments as you get to the modern era. But the kings, of course, had tremendous power, and the Magna Carta kind of comes in, and it goes back out, and it comes back in. They have a civil war after it. But still, it's an important step forward for the idea that you're going to not only have a national government, but a limited one as well. And so there's John, he's thinking about the Magna Carta, and he's probably, my guess is, how do I get out of signing this, right? But he is going to sign it, and it will go into effect. This is what it looks like. Still remarkably well-preserved document here from the medieval period. As we continue to talk about this consolidation of power, one of the people we have to talk about is Edward I, right? And he continues to expand the power base in England. He's going to go into Wales. He's going to conquer Wales and take over parts of that. My guys in Wales, right? He's also going to continue to expand his power on the continent by attacking France, and he fails in a number of attempts to capture Scotland. Super interesting stuff, except that all isn't as important as the overall effect that this has on his rule, which is all this military activity drains his treasury, right? So what he's going to do is he's going to expand this great council of barons and the church prelates to include a lot of the local nobility and also prominent urban leaders. These are merchant class people, mostly, right? And what this did by bringing them into this, he said, hey, welcome to the big league. You guys got to pay, though, to get in. This allowed him to raise some taxes because, especially initially, these guys that are admitted to Parliament, right, are going to say, hey, yeah, that's great. Yeah, okay, sure, no problem. Here's some money. But over the course of time, hey, king, hey, government, what are you doing with my money? And so this is going to become a problem over the course of the next centuries for the monarchy because kings increasingly are going to have to get into a power struggle with Parliament's control over the purse strings. This is a much later meeting of Parliament, but it still gives you an idea of kind of what we're talking about with the commoners and the lords and then the speaker, etc., 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 right? Our counterpoint example to what's taking place there is in Central Europe. And our main character, at least initially, is Friedrich de Barbarossa, or Frederick Barbarossa, as we might say, right? Fred the Redbeard, right? He's a Germanic king, and he seeks to expand his control over the Holy Roman Empire into really all of Italy. He wants the Holy Roman Empire to kind of come back. Now, his main political opponent with this is the papacy, right? The popes fear this loss of secular power in their controlled territories in central Italy and in a few other places. They're really afraid of another Charlemagne type of scenario where you have this kind of warlord who is going to dominate them, right? Well, Frederick needs a financial base in this area, and he secures the attribute of these northern Italian city-states by allowing them to have a great deal of autonomy. He gets the money. He also is going to make a dynastic marriage of his son, Henry VI, with a princess controlling southern Italy. That's going to thus encircle the Papal States, which is in the central part of that. He's got northern Italy, he's got southern Italy, and then Frederick's going to die, right? His son Henry tries to put this back together, but he tries to do this in such a controlling fashion that he leads to this fracturing of the empire again. So there's Friedrich de Barbarossa. There he is presiding over this dynastic marriage. There's an artist's rendition of what he may have looked like with this. And this is, of course, he makes the Pope do this dynastic marriage, which I think is pretty cool. The one thing that he didn't want to see, right? So the next guy to really take his hand at this is Frederick II. This is Barbarossa's grandson. And he tries to reconstitute this empire, but is really going to fall apart. Nobody really wants to be under his control outside of the places that they kind of have to deal with him, which is in Germany. He goes into northern Italy where these guys have thrown off imperial control, and he gets defeated. The popes, of course, they're not interested in helping this guy out. And while he's on all these adventures, of military excursion and political excursion in Italy, he's forced to leave Germany to mostly local rule, right? What's going to happen is these guys realize that local rule is awesome. You don't have to have a boss. You can do whatever you want. And so these German princes at the next election cycle for the new Holy Roman Emperorship, they kick out Frederick's family, right? And they replace them with the Habsburgs. Now, the reason that the Habsburgs were chosen is not because they were great war fighters or great leaders or super wealthy or look really good filling out a suit. They were chosen because they were weak. The Habsburgs, who are these people? Now, they would grow more powerful over time because the one thing that they were good at was marrying their sons and daughters into just the right families at just the right times to take power. But you could also just chalk that up to they were just really, really lucky, right? So thus what you're going to see is both Germany and Italy, or at least what you and I would call Germany and Italy today, are moving away from national unification. They're given into fracturing or local warlordism rather than towards central autonomy. So this is in contrast with what we see going on in England and France. And so there's Frederick II. I like this one because he just looks bummed, right? His lower lip's poking out there. This is Rome. This is Italy, rather. There's the Roman papal states with this, and then you can see the northern Italian city-states and then southern Italy, and how they wind up disunited throughout this period as well. And then Germany itself begins breaking it down into more local autonomy, with the Holy Roman Empire having only nominal kind of tacit control. So as the power of a lot of these places are in flux, one of the things that's pretty constant, right, is the political power of the church. Now, many of these local religious leaders are becoming ever more increasingly involved in governmental tasks, and their religious duties, just, I'll pray to God for you, that kind of stuff, really begins to slide, right? The popes of the High Middle Ages are also seeking to rid the vassalage of the bishops to the kings. They want to make sure that the popes themselves are the ones that are doing this. Now, the number one weapon that the popes have in their arsenal is excommunication. And they're going to threaten kings, emperors, dukes, barons, all these people with this if they don't support these reforms, right? Now, the moves are largely successful because nobody wants to be excommunicated from the church or run into other, economic and political problems that the Pope can cause you. But this serves to empower the popes even more and leads to greater and not lesser involvement in the politics of the age. In fact, through much of this period, the Pope regarded himself as kind of the emperor over all of Christian Europe. Much of this activity, though, that we need to talk about is going to take place in Asia, right? And for 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire is going to kind of continue on. But by the time you get to the year 1000 or so, the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, is going through some series of declines. You have some internal conflicts that have taken over from within the Byzantine families, but also we're going to see that it is the press of Asiatic Muslims that are beginning to erode their control in the region. You'd had a number of religious disagreements that had arisen for a long time between the Pope's role, whether he's supposed to be the final arbiter, on earth, some other theological disagreements between, creedal statements and stuff like that. But mainly it was cultural and political. You had the Greek-speaking East, you had the Latin-speaking West, until eventually you'll see that the Pope and the Greek Patriarch, which is essentially the Greek Pope, right? They're going to excommunicate each other. They're going to, in 1054, they're going to throw each other out of each other's churches, and we're not technically part of each other anymore. But all that does is kind of cement a drift that had been taking place for hundreds of years. And so you have then the Greek Orthodox and then the Roman Catholic Church. So they're fully and officially separate, right? So the Byzantine Empire naturally is in the Greek, and then most of European Christians are in with the Latin Church, right? The Roman Church. More importantly, we're going to have a change in Islam. You had an influx of new converts to Islam. The Arabs had kind of spent their early wave of expansionism, but then you have these people, the Seljuks. They're Turks. They're Turks from Central Asia, and they move into this area and they convert to Islam. And they convert with the zeal of new converts, and they're very interested in pressing their advantage, especially on the frontier with the Byzantine Empire. And they had taken over rule of many of the Asian Muslims and even had begun driving back the Byzantines. It eventually gets really, really close to Constantinople itself, and this is going to force the Byzantine emperor, at this time, a guy named Alexius Comnenus, to break down and call for aid from Western Christians. So that's what's going to take place with this. So here's a scene of the Seljuk Turks. They're especially noted for their light weaponry, horseback archery, where they ride around, fire some arrows, and then kind of move, fire some more arrows. And then once they've kind of weakened the enemy position, then these guys with these lances would kind of ride in and cause havoc. They're light, they're ready to move at a moment's notice, but that's who these guys are. They closed the road to Christian pilgrims to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was part of this pilgrimage movement that Christians would go to Jerusalem and they would pray and then would come back home. And the Seljuks say, no, we're not going to have that anymore. You also have then the threat to the Byzantine Empire, and so finally here, Pope Urban II is going to go to a meeting in South France, and he preaches what we call a crusade, right, to the nobility of Europe. He promises salvation to all who die fighting the infidel. His actual words, depending on which version of French you use, du vol, right, or des vous, right, which is God wills it. God wants you to go and do this. Well, you know, the Christian church, they're kind of keeping a leash on these knights and warlords and dukes and barons that are riding around these suits of armor. They're really not supposed to be killing each other like crazy. And so it's kind of restraining influence. And they're like, listen, Jesus doesn't want us killing each other. Okay, right? They still kind of were doing it. But then he comes along and says, no, there's a group of people that you can just go out and slaughter. Well, who's it? Well, this is the Muslims. Go get them. So you have a permission slip now, essentially from the leader of the Christian church, to go and just have at these guys. And that's exactly what's going to happen here. Do not get lost, though, in overall sort of religious imagery that, well, we're the Christians and we hate the Muslims, and the Muslims, we're the Muslims, and we hate the Christians. There is important religious activity with this, but that's not the only ingredient in this soup, all right? There's a strong political reason for this. The Pope, why does he want to do this, right? Well, he's Christian, and he wants to restore the Holy Land to Christian hands and get Christian pilgrims in there. Yeah, I'm sure that that's a motivating factor, but it also serves a great purpose for him, and that is this gets Europe's military power, or at least a big chunk of it, out of the continent. Let's go have them at each other, rather than their constant internal power struggles. One, you're not going to have Christians killing other Christians. Two, you're also going to decrease the risk that one of these great warlords is going to rise like a Charlemagne or like the attempted, Frederick Barbarossa and cause you problems. So bleed off all this excess military strength onto somebody else, right? Now, the first to answer in an organized way were these Frankish princes, and a few Italians, and some other people who were not in line to inherit. These are all second and third sons. For them, it's an opportunity to seek new lands and titles along with the religious hope of salvation. The leader that they choose is Godfrey of Bouillon, right? Or Jeff, if you want to call him. Geoffrey, right? Godfrey of Bouillon, which is a city that's now in Belgium. He was considered a Frankish prince, what might be French at this point. There he is, right? Beautiful, right? God wills it, right? And these are the Crusaders, right? Where you've got Godfrey and Bohemond and Edward and some of these other guys that are going to go along with these adventures. Now, the First Crusade is, of all the different specific military campaigns, is probably the most interesting. It's also the only one that really succeeds for the Christians. The rest of them are, for the most part, victories by the much larger, more numerous Muslim forces. These Western armies, they meet at Constantinople to try to cross, at that point, into Asia. Alexius, who had called for aid from Western Christians, didn't know that these huge armies were going to show up, and was really kind of shocked. He thought that little bands of mercenaries might show up that he can sort of buy off and send to fight along the frontier. So he says, okay, basically you guys got to swear an oath of fealty to him. And you give me any lands that were mine that you captured from the Turks, and then any lands that were your own, they're going to give to you. And so they all, yeah, okay, yeah, sure, whatever. Nobody really is totally okay with that. They cross into Asia, and the first place that they're going to do battle with is at the fortress city of Nicaea, right? Just before the Crusaders are going to move in and take the city, and they were really looking at, sort of helping themselves, is Alexius is going to move in, right? He prevents the Crusaders from their plunder, and both sides are kind of left bitter by the situation. So the Crusaders are going to kind of abandon Alexius's forces pretty early on, and they're just going to start heading inward. The Crusaders are going to move eastward now into the Anatolia Peninsula, and they divide their army so it can march a little better, right? Reinforcements from Aleppo come at these guys, and they attack the Crusaders at a place called Dorilai, right? Now, the Turks manage to isolate the infantry, and they start crushing these guys, and just as they're about to sort of overwhelm the infantry, Godfrey's cavalry shows up, and this is the flower of European knighthood. And they array their forces, and they charge at the enemy, and exactly what you would think with the one thing that these guys are really, really good at, which is charging at them on heavy horse, is exactly what happens. They crush these guys, and they drive them out of the way in this open field battle. So here you can see a historic print of what Dorilai might have looked like with these guys sort of charging through this area. This is a little bit more of perhaps historic view where these guys charge right at the tail end of the Seljuk army, and they drive them off, and this is them sort of going up the slope and driving them off with their cavalry. The Crusaders' armies, throughout much of the rest of this kind of period, they sort of peeled off and established a few of these Crusader states, like one at Edessa and a couple of other places, right? But eventually they reformed their army and they arrived at Antioch. Antioch is the fortress city that controlled the coastal road back to Constantinople. So if you wanted more reinforcements, resupply, you wanted to maintain communications, you have to capture Antioch. The problem with this is Antioch is a ridiculously enormous city, okay? You had probably the best fortified city in the region, even more so than Jerusalem, which we'll see later. And so they have to surround the city as best as they can. And it turns out that the siege of the city is going to last 8 months. They try various attempts to get up and over the walls, and they never are even able to completely surround it. So the Crusaders did the best they could. They blockaded the gates, but they began to run short of food even themselves, right? The city is going to reach a tipping point in June of 1098, all right? Starving on the inside, finally a Muslim trader is persuaded by Bohemond to open the gates and allow the Crusaders in, and they would do so. And so this is the Crusaders outside the walls of Antioch, and you can see it's a pretty imposing edifice with this. But what happens here is a relief force of Turks from Damascus finally arrive. They arrive just after these guys go into the city, and now the besiegers are themselves besieged. They're trapped in a city that had already run out of food, and they begin to starve. They begin to eat dead horses. They begin to do, it's gross, but it's pretty bad, right? What you're going to see is one of the people that was with the Crusaders was this priest, and he was not a war fighter. He was just a religious figure, and he says, I had a dream that the lance that pierced Christ's side of the crucifixion is buried here in the city. And it's under the walls of this church. And so they start digging. They don't find it. He says, here, let me find it. And he rolls up his sleeves, takes off his shoes and socks, and starts feeling around. And he comes up, aha, I found it. Of course, it looks more like a 11th century Frankish lance than a 1st century Roman lance. Who cares, right? This is good enough, right? So the Crusaders, they're starting to fight these guys off, and they've had this sort of miracle, right, that takes place, and so they put the lance on one of these knights' spears, and they open the gates of the city, and they ride out to attack this much larger Muslim army. This is a surprise. The Muslims didn't, why would they come out to fight us? But they charge these guys, and they drive off this much larger force. What this means now is the road to Jerusalem is open. So here you can see artist depiction of them riding out and attacking these guys and driving them off. The Crusaders then are going to besiege Jerusalem, and they capture it much less time. It doesn't take them 8 months. It only takes them 5 weeks. They also have more wood in the area, so they're able to construct some of those siege towers to get up and over the walls much more easily. They proceeded then also to slaughter the inhabitants of the city, pretty much like everywhere else that they had been, right? Now Godfrey, because they're victorious, they capture Jerusalem. They say, you should be the king. You're going to be our new king. You're going to be the overlord of the whole area. But he takes the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. The Holy Sepulchre is Christ's tomb in Jerusalem. And he says, I'm a defender. I refuse to wear a crown of gold in the city where Christ wore a crown of thorns. But Godfrey dies, right? And his brother, Baldwin, is brought in because Godfrey has no children. And he has absolutely no problem with being a king. Yeah, I'll be king of Jerusalem. Sounds good to me. And so the Crusaders then are going to set up 4 main states in Palestine. And this is a depiction, gives you an idea. These are the siege towers. These guys are going up and over the walls to take Jerusalem. And the map shows this is the kingdom of Jerusalem with its 3 dependent states, the counties of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the county of Tripoli. You'll also notice these guys are in a pretty thin strip surrounded by a lot of potentially hostile forces. The Second Crusade was a failure. They tried to capture Damascus, and they couldn't do this. But regardless, you look at that map, and you see that the Crusader states are in a pretty perilous situation. They're surrounded by an ocean of Muslim enemies. One of the problems was that the Muslims were themselves disunited. You had the Fatimids in Egypt, you had the Arabs, you had the Seljuks, you had these different sort of warring factions until finally they're all brought under the same banner of this guy Salahuddin, right? Or Salahadin, depending on how you want to pronounce it. In English, we would say Salah, right? And this warrior, he becomes the vizier of Egypt, he becomes the leader in Arabia, and so he's able to unite them. And what had happened was these Muslim armies, they would kind of attack the Crusaders, and then they'd lose steam, and the Crusaders would kind of push them back out. And then they would do this again. It was this kind of back and forth dance that would take place. But Saladin was able to keep constant pressure on the Crusaders. And all he had to wait for was a mistake that they would make with their army. And so finally, in 1187, they're going to make that mistake. He's going to catch their army off guard at a place called Hetton. and he's going to wreck their army, capture their king, and then move into Jerusalem and capture it, right? Now, Christian Europe is shocked, right? They were used to the idea that, for 80 some odd years, right, Jerusalem was a Christian city again, and so they didn't have to worry about this. And so the Pope is going to preach a new crusade. We got to go back, we got to rescue Jerusalem again. This time, though, it's directly to the crowned heads of Western and Central Europe. And so there's Saladin. This is him, he's on his war horse. He's got his scimitar, right? And this is going to lead us directly to the Third Crusade. Our main characters of this are going to be Richard the Lionheart, right, of England, King of England, and Philip Augustus, King of France. They actually had included Frederick de Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, but he was taking a bath in a river on the crusade. His guys weren't even all the way down there yet. He drowns in the river and dies, and so his army just goes home. It's a very anticlimactic way to die. Instead of going overland, like we saw with the First Crusade, is they're going to come in via the water. They're going to contract with these Italian merchants to use their ships as kind of a navy. And when they worked in conjunction with their naval forces, they were extremely successful. They could pick where they wanted to attack, how they were going to be resupplied, and so they capture some of these coastal cities. And they fight pitched battles with Saladin's forces everywhere, but they really never get enough oomph to go in and capture Jerusalem. Philip abandons the crusade first because he realizes that, hey, while I'm here in the Middle East, who's back in France running the show? There could be shenanigans. Richard conceived of himself as the new Lancelot from sort of King Arthur's mythical tales, and he continued to fight onward, right? But eventually he gave up and returned home with nothing to show for his trip except for a huge amount of slaughter in the wake of his armies and a lot of expense for his country. This is true for Cyprus, Acre, etc., etc. And so there's Richard the Lionheart. He would love, if he was here, the fact that I'm showing you this photo. That so proud, so tall, standing on the ship, getting on the ship to go to the Holy Land like a conqueror, right? In his white and red uniform to go off and fight. And of course, this is him in battle, right? This is back when kings actually fought. He was a big dude, and you would not probably want to try to take him in a one-on-one fight. But there he is atop his war horse, stomping on and killing all these people with this. And this gives you an idea of kind of the overall campaign. And while they're staying close to the coast, they're having a lot of success. But as they try to move towards Jerusalem, they get stymied and they never totally succeed. Crusades really began to vary a lot with this. You'll see, for example, the Fourth Crusade is highlight how important these Italian merchants and the cities that supported them had been becoming. They were the main conduit into and out of the Holy Land once it is at least a toehold is taken by Christian forces. And so they're making tons of money, all right? They were the main suppliers to the Crusade states. They were the main transportation for reinforcements, and they begin to exert their influence, and you can see it by the Fourth Crusade. Now, the Fourth Crusade set out from Italy to try to attack the Muslims, recapture Jerusalem, but the Italian merchants, no, we need to go to Constantinople first, where, of course, they managed to get embroiled into a local dispute over the succession to the Byzantine Empire's throne. One thing leads to another very, very quickly. The next thing, hey, the Crusaders are going to attack Constantinople because they're not really the same kind of Christians that we are anyway, and they greatly weaken it and its defenses and its merchant fleet. So, what? I thought you were going to go attack the Muslims, and you attack these other guys. Well, it turns out that one of the Italian merchants, these Italian merchants' main competitors was Constantinople. Okay, and so this attack on them is going to remove a potential threat to their trade dominance in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so this is, you can see the siege of this, and then as these guys are sort of looming to get into the city and get up and over the walls and take it over, and this is them looting Constantinople in the Fourth Crusade. Well, unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about every single specific military campaign. But you do need to understand that not only were they specific kind of armies that would go in and say, well, this is the First Crusade, this is Seventh Crusade, this is the Ninth Crusade, that kind of thing. But in many cases, they were also just sort of waves of people assaulting the Holy Land. You'll also see that this produces its own set of specific to the Crusades groups of people, and these were these orders of knights. The two main ones to talk about are the Templars and the Hospitallers. And they formed to fight Muslims. They devoted themselves to only fighting against these Muslim forces, and they want to keep the Holy Land clear for Christians, Christian pilgrims and travelers, and things like that. And they only swore loyalty to the head of their order, the vows of poverty. They would only carry their weapons, and they're going to die in service to Christian forces, that kind of thing. Once the Crusades are over, these guys, as they're moving back to Europe, They become their own organizations there. Now, the future specific military campaigns, they ever were decreasing in size and in scope. They almost always failed. They gave up on Jerusalem. We would really like to go and capture it, but it's not going to happen, right? But always we're going to see a huge amount of slaughter. Civilians, warriors, Jews, Muslims, and there's a great deal of bitterness that still exists today as a result of the Crusades. So this is our Knights Templar. This is what he sort of looked like with this. So you have, as the Crusades are winding down, another event that comes in on the heels of this in the 1300s. You're going to see some climactic changes that have been affecting Europe in the early to mid 1400s. And that was temperatures had cooled, you had crop production decreased, you're also going to then have a drought that follows on the heel of that. Anyway, less food production equals less people. The ensuing famines killed about 10% of the population of Europe, North Africa, and parts of Asia. Following that, in the mid-1300s then, is going to be a series of plagues that are going to hit Europe, Asia, North Africa, and it's going to spread outward on the trade routes. And it's going to hit Europe from south to north between these dates of 1347 and 1351. By 1351, somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 to 50%, kind of depending on how you want to deal with the numbers, of Europe. And other populations around the world were similarly affected. These people had died. This is anywhere between like 19 and 38 million. Some of the most recent figures I've seen place this somewhere around 30 million. But it's just tens of millions of people are going to die over a really, really, really short period of time. You're also then going to see that subsequent outbreaks are going to periodically hit Europe as a result of this. In fact, it's not going to be until about 1500 that European populations begin a sustainable recovery of this. And so here you can see the phase lines of as this disease goes forward. Now, some places they're relatively free of the disease, and then some places were almost completely wiped out as a result of that. These arrows, it gives you an idea of kind of how the disease spreads, and of course following the trade lines where these people are carrying this. And so you'll see that people are forced to get involved with burying their dead and doing this, and then eventually there are too many people to bury all at once, and so you've just got to carry these people out in piles and burn the bodies. So it's pretty radical, horrible events that begin to take place. So how does this affect people? Well, obviously on the one hand, you're going to have a psychological, humanitarian effect. Half your family dies very, very shortly, right? A lot of people in town, half the city dies in a very short period of time. So how do people that survive view this? Well, they view the plague, generally speaking, in supernatural terms, which shouldn't really surprise us given what we know about this period, right? Now, for Christians in Europe, they generally view this as either God's punishment, we've done something wrong and God is punishing us, or he's allowed Satan to do this against us somehow, right? Some, for example, try to purify themselves by public beatings. Of course, you always have the standard, let's go kill some Jews and see if that makes God happy, that kind of thing. There's also an important economic component because you have the working populations that radically go down. But in many cases, the same amount of work still has to be done. So this means that wage prices are going to go up. You have almost the same amount of work that still needs to be done when we're talking about fields or road maintenance or things like that. And yet now the number of people that can do that go way down. So you say, hey, my labor now is a great deal more valuable. Also, you're going to see that prices are going down. Now, the people that feel this pinch the most are the local feudal lords. They're the ones that command the power in terms of having to hire workers or also sell products. So what these guys do, though, is they understand that they have the sword as well. They have the power of the law on their side. And so they simply try to clamp down on wages. No, you guys can't have a raise. No, you can't do this. But these rising costs continue to weaken these manorial lords as their bank books just don't sort of match what they're trying to do. And these peasants are ever increasingly leaving serfdom because they have this economic power now on their side and moving into paying the rents, right? So this feudal aristocratic power begins to weaken as these peasants gain more and more freedom. And here you can see the flagellants. These are these guys that would whip each other. And then a little political cartoon talking about how death was right around the corner, right? So this post-plague Europe is going to face a number of problems. This is going to be economic dislocation. You've got problems everywhere of who's producing food, who's producing these goods, how are we trading it. We have a lot of death. And then you're going to have another war, 100 years war between Britain and France, and the nobility trying to maintain their power in what is now a very different world following the plagues. This rising economic power of the peasants is going to manifest itself in a couple of major revolts, one in France in 1358 and one in England in 1381, and a number of smaller ones. Now, the way that these break out is that these revolts are seeing these peasants in rural areas and workers in cities rising up against this attempt to control their labor by the nobility, who no longer really serve the function that they used to serve of why they got power in the first place. Instead, they're just using it as, hey, I should be in charge. Well, why? Well, I just should be. So anyway, they rise up with violence. These are violent overthrows. They attack the local lords, and if they get their hands on them, they kill them. They burn their stuff down, they take them. But these guys then quickly band together because they've got the communications, they've got the organizations, and of course they've got the swords, right? And they put these guys down quickly and violently. But they usher in an era of social discontent because the ones that don't get killed, well, I can't revolt now, maybe later. That's what they're going to come up with. And so this is the one in France. These are these guys that are being killed and dumped in the river. Now we need to talk about the 100 Years' War. It's technically 116 years, but that doesn't sound nearly as cool, right? And it leads us to try to understand why you have such a complicated situation in Europe at this point. And that is the fact that the English kings were also landowners in France. So while you may be king of England, you are under the king of France for your French holdings. So you're sort of equal, sort of subordinate, right? And so as the French kings are trying to absorb more and more power into themselves over especially the nobility, you're going to see that they're going to ask these English kings to swear loyalty to them, right? You're going to have a dispute over the succession to the French throne. England's Edward III actually had probably what was the stronger claim, but none of the French nobles wanted to see an English guy come in as the French king, and so they make sure that the French guy, Philip VI, gets the throne. When Philip calls Edward and, hey, you got to swear loyalty to me as a landholder in France, he says, no. I'm not going to swear loyalty to what he referred to the so-called king of France, because he felt that I should be the king of France. Well, you can't do that. You can't tell the king, no, I'm going to swear an oath of allegiance to you. That's essentially a tantamount to, I'm in treason against you. So Philip has his forces seize Gascony, which is part of Edward's French holdings. Edward, though, also is king of England. He has the other hat. Literally, it's a hat, right? And he declares war on France as king of England. Now, a 100-year war does not mean there's fighting every single day, all right? And in fact, it goes through a series of phases, and we're not going to have a chance to talk about all of this, right? France's military and England's military are very different in the way that they approached warfare. France relies still very heavily on the mounted knight, but England had ever increasingly, from the end of the Crusades onward, using more and more foot soldiers, such as pikemen to try to hold back horses, and then archers and crossbowmen to try to inflict damage at long range, right? Now, the early phase of the war saw some English early successes. They're going to meet at Crécy and Poitiers, and these English archers, they do a number on these French knights, but these are kind of small engagements compared to what's going to happen a little bit later, right? Now, the problem for the English is, even though they're winning the battles early on, they really don't have the manpower to conquer all of France. They don't have these armies that are big enough to do this. So throughout this first phase, 1337 to 1359, the English attempted to avoid these pitched battles because they felt that their forces would get crushed. They would get overwhelmed. So instead, they want to weaken the French by engaging in economic warfare, right? They ravage the countryside, they attack the peasants, they drive them away, and then the French won't have the resources to come after them. So here you can see a tale of two armies, right? The French knights that are on horseback, and then these English pikemen as they march off to war. And so you can see this gives you kind of an idea. You have the pikemen with their staves in the front, and then the archers in the back as they're trying to inflict these casualties on the knights. Over the course of time, though, French numbers began to tell, and they began reducing these English fortresses by attacking them one at a time. But after 1374, England is going to have a new leader, and it's going to be Henry V. Henry V is one of those great sort of war-fighting, war-captain kings. Henry defeated the French in a massive victory at the Battle of Agincourt. His army had been maneuvering, and he gets the French to attack him between two sort of heavily wooded areas and over a muddy field, where his guys were in a slightly elevated position. What this meant was French cavalry was going to be in this very contained corridor for a short period of time, and his archers are going to be able to launch, arrow after arrow at these guys. And 1,500 of these French knights are going to go down. You also have to understand that for the most part, these are also French noblemen. This is the local government. This is going to cause a great deal of not only military problems for the French, but also political and social problems as well, as much of the local fabric is now disrupted. So England is going to gain control of essentially the northern third of France as a result of this massive victory at Agincourt. So you can get the idea from the photos here of how this worked itself out. By 1428, France is really kind of on the ropes, right? The English are besieging the fortress of Orleans in the Loire Valley, right? To give you a sense of what this, I know that French geography may not be your strong suit, this would be like an enemy army here in the United States. They've moved up the Mississippi River and they've surrounded the city of St. Louis. They're in the middle of our country, right? They're about to take over the whole thing. That's when we have something odd happening, right? The French rally around this girl, Joan d'Arc, or Joan of Arc as we might say in English, and she was a young peasant girl who said, I had visions from God, right? And her mission from God is to make sure that Charles, is crowned, it was then the sort of the king in waiting, but you have to crown him at a specific spot, right? And you will be king, and we will drive out the English, right? And so they follow her because she talks to God, right? Well, they do this, right? She accompanies the French army to Orleans, where they break the siege line, and then they start attacking the English, and they drive them all the way out the Loire Valley. Now, I don't want to underestimate the influence that Jean played in this, but I think the introduction of cannons from the east may have had a role as well, being able to actually literally blast these guys off the continent, right? It's not always good to be a major figure in the Middle Ages because she's actually caught by allies of the English and burned alive for wearing men's clothes and being a heretic and all this kind of stuff, so it's not all that great, right? The French, though, are going to continue to eventually press the English further and further out of the war, and eventually they would win, right? But both of these monarchies are pretty badly weakened as a result of that. So here you can see some French art. There's Joan of Arc with the angels of God attending her as she goes into battle, and then she's eventually set on fire. So it's not really the best as we talk about this. Now, monarchies throughout Europe are declining in power in terms of the papal states as well. You got a lot of death, you got a lot of killing, you got a lot of war. Philip IV of France attempted to tax the French clergy to raise money, right? So he's going to tax these guys in the church. You guys deal with a lot of money, we're going to tax you guys. And the Pope said no. And if you do this, I'm going to excommunicate you, Philip. You're going to, you can't be in the church anymore, so you go to hell, right? Philip says, I don't think so, right? Philip sent troops to Italy to capture the Pope. Philip's not just going to wait around like other kings had done. He's going to send guys, and he's going to grab the Pope, and he's going to make the Pope do what he wants him to do. Well, the Pope managed to escape, but at least according to one account, the stress was too much for him. He's a pretty old guy. He had a heart attack and he died. Now, for those of you who don't know how this works, when the Pope dies, you have then a meeting of the cardinals, the upper leadership of the church, and they have to elect a new Pope. Well, who is it that's still in Rome? That's right, the French army under Philip. Philip made sure that the cardinals elected a French guy as Pope, which they did. I don't know that there were swords held to their throats, but you guys get the idea of why they would have done this. This Pope was Clement V, and he decided to move his residence and the site of the papal government. We don't need to really be in Rome anymore. Let's move to Avignon, which technically was not a part of France, but was right across the river from southern France. And so it was pretty obvious what was going on. Right? This is in Provence, right? And there's Avignon, right, in southern France. And so for 72 years, the popes are going to reside in Avignon. That's at least one line of the popes. There are actually a lot of people that then, no, this guy's not the real pope. We're going to elect another pope. At one point, I think there were like 3 running around at various points with this. But it was becoming pretty obvious that now the pope was no longer this independent political entity, that he was just the mouthpiece of the king of France. And so this is going to cause them to lose a considerable amount of power and authority, because when you're just getting this from the king of France, it's one thing to get from the popes, like, God wants you to do this. Okay, right? Or at least, hey, the power of the church wants you to do this. Okay. When he says, hey, God says you really shouldn't do that. Is that you talking to God, or is that really just the king of France telling you to say that? So this decline in church power eventually would lead the popes back to Rome to try to establish some of their independence. But really, the political damage to the church authority had been done by that point.